Both answered not very well, but McCary's next step was to have Dunn play Home on the Range as best she could, while Bellamy sang off-key. The actors did not enjoy this rather humiliating exercise, but McCary was delighted and filmed the entire song. None of this was in the script, but all of it ended up in the film. Sometimes the actors would wait on set while McCary would mess around on the piano, then suddenly come up with an idea for what to shoot that day. One morning, Cohn visited the set and witnessed this odd process. "I hired you to make a great comedy so I could show up Frank Capra. The only one who's going to laugh at this picture is Capra," he exclaimed. Cohn was disgusted and basically wrote the whole thing off. His irritation grew daily, but he was contractually bound to pay Dunn $40,000 for the film, whether it was shot or not. He could not fire McCary at this point without creating greater problems, nor could he have him go back to the original script, since McCary had already begun shooting and only he seemed to know where the film was going. Yet, as the days went on, the actors began to see some method in McCary's madness. He would shoot them in long takes, in which much of their work was only loosely guided. The scenes had spontaneity and liveliness. Casual as he seemed, he knew what he wanted and would reshoot the simplest shot if the look on the actors' faces was not loving enough. His shoot days were short and to the point. One day, after many days' absence, Cohn showed up on set to find McCary serving drinks to the cast. Cohn was about to explode when the director told him they were drinking to celebrate. They had just finished shooting. Cohn was shocked and delighted. McCary had finished ahead of schedule and $200,000 under budget. Then, to his surprise as well, the picture came together in the editing room like a strange puzzle. It was good, very good. Test audiences roared with laughter. Premiering in 1937, The Awful Truth was a complete success and won McCary the Best Director Oscar. Cohn had found his new Frank Capra. Unfortunately, McCary had seen his boss's dictatorial tendencies all too clearly, and though Cohn made lucrative offers, McCary never worked for Columbia again. Interpretation. Leo McCary, one of the great directors of Hollywood's golden era, was essentially a frustrated composer and songwriter. He had gone to work directing slapstick comedies — McCary was the man who paired Laurel with Hardy — only because he was unable to make a living in music. The Awful Truth is considered one of the greatest screwball comedies ever made, and both its style and the way McCary worked on it stemmed from his musical instincts. He composed the film in his head in just the same loose yet logical way that he would tinker with the tune on the piano. To create a film this way required two things: room to maneuver and the ability to channel chaos and confusion into the creative process. McCary kept his distance from Cohn, the actors, the screenwriters, in fact, everyone, as best he could. He would not let himself be boxed in by anyone's idea of how to shoot a film. Given room to maneuver, he could improvise, experiment, move fluidly in different directions in any scene, yet keep everything perfectly controlled. He always seemed to know what he wanted and what worked. And because filmmaking this way made every day a fresh challenge, the actors had to respond with their own energy, rather than simply regurgitating words from a script. McCary allowed room for chance and the random events of life to enter his creative scheme without being overwhelmed by chaos. The scene he was inspired to create when he learned of Dunn's and Bellamy's lack of musical skill, for example, seems unrehearsed and lifelike because it really was. Had it been scripted, it would have been far less funny. Directing a film, or any project, artistic or professional or scientific, is like fighting a war. There's a certain strategic logic to the way you attack a problem, shape your work, deal with friction, and the discrepancy between what you want and what you get. Directors or artists often start out with great ideas, but in the planning create such a straitjacket for themselves, such a rigid script to follow and form to fit in, that the process loses all joy. There's nothing left to explore in the creation itself, and the end result seems lifeless and disappointing. On the other side, artists may start with a loose idea that seems promising, but they are too lazy or undisciplined to give it shape and form. They create so much space and confusion that in the end, nothing coheres. The solution is to plan, to have a clear idea what you want, then put yourself in open space and give yourself options to work with. You direct the situation, but leave room for unexpected opportunities and random events. Both generals and artists can be judged by the way they handle chaos and confusion, embracing it, yet guiding it for their own purposes. 5. One day in the Japan of the 1540s, in a ferry boat crowded with farmers, merchants, and craftsmen, a young samurai regaled all who would listen with tales of his great victories as a swordsman, wielding his 3-foot-long sword as he spoke to demonstrate his prowess. The other passengers were a little afraid of this athletic young man, so they feigned interest in his stories to avoid trouble. But one older man sat to the side, ignoring the young boaster. The older man was obviously a samurai himself. He carried 2 swords, but no one knew that this was in fact Tsukahara Bokuden, perhaps the greatest swordsman of his time. He was in his 50s by then and liked to travel alone and incognito. Bokuden sat with his eyes closed, seemingly deep in meditation. His stillness and silence began to annoy the young samurai, who finally called out, "Don't you like this kind of talk? You don't even know how to wield a sword, old man, do you?" "I most certainly do," answered Bokuden. "My way, however, is not to wield my sword in such inconsequential circumstances as these." "A way of using a sword that doesn't use a sword?" said the young samurai. "Don't talk gibberish. What is your school of fighting called?" "It is called Mutakatsu Ryu, style that wins without swords or fighting," replied Bokuden. "What? Mutakatsu Ryu? Don't be ridiculous. How can you defeat an opponent without fighting?" By now the young samurai was angry and irritated, and he demanded that Bokuden demonstrate his style, challenging him to a fight then and there. Bokuden refused to duel in the crowded boat, but said he would show the samurai Mutakatsu Ryu at the nearest shore, and he asked the ferryman to guide the boat to a tiny nearby island. The young man began to swing his sword to loosen up. Bokuden continued to sit with his eyes closed. As they approached the island, the impatient challenger shouted, "Come, you are as good as dead. I will show you how sharp my sword is." He then leaped onto the shore. Bokuden took his time, further infuriating the young samurai, who began to hurl insults. Bokuden finally handed the ferryman his sword, saying, "My style is Mutakatsu Ryu. I have no need for a sword." And with those words, he took the ferryman's long oar and pushed it hard against the shore, sending the boat quickly out into the water and away from the island. The samurai screamed, demanding the boat's return. Bokuden shouted back to him, "This is what is called victory without fighting. I dare you to jump into the water and swim here." Now the passengers on the boat could look back at the young samurai receding into the distance, stranded on the island, jumping up and down, flailing his arms as his cries became fainter and fainter. They began to laugh. Bokuden had clearly demonstrated Mutakatsu Ryu. Interpretation. The minute Bokuden heard the arrogant young samurai's voice, he knew there would be trouble. A duel on a crowded boat would be a disaster, and a totally unnecessary one. He had to get the young man off the boat without a fight, and to make the defeat humiliating. He would do this through maneuver. First, he remained still and quiet, drawing the man's attention away from the innocent passengers and drawing him toward Bokuden like a magnet. Then, he confused the man with a rather irrational name for a school of fighting, overheating the samurai's rather simple mind with a perplexing concept. The flustered samurai tried to cover up with bluster. He was now so angry and mentally off balance that he leaped to the shore alone, failing to consider the rather obvious meaning of mutakatsuryu, even once he got there. Bokuden was a samurai who always depended on setting up his opponents first and winning the victory easily, by maneuver rather than brute force. This was the ultimate demonstration of his art. The goal of maneuver is to give you easy victories, which you do by luring opponents into leaving their fortified positions of strength for unfamiliar terrain where they must fight off balance. Since your opponent's strength is inseparable from their ability to think straight, your maneuvers must be designed to make them emotional and befuddled. If you are too direct in this maneuvering, you run the risk of revealing your game. You must be subtle, drawing opponents toward you with enigmatic behavior, slowly getting under their skin with provocative comments and actions, then suddenly stepping back. When you feel that their emotions are engaged, that their frustration and anger are mounting, you can speed up the tempo of your maneuvers. Properly set up, your opponents will leap onto the island and strand themselves, giving you the easy victory. Reversal. There is neither point nor honor in seeking direct battle for its own sake. That kind of fighting, however, may have value as part of a maneuver or strategy. A sudden envelopment or powerful frontal blow when the enemy is least expecting it can be crushing. The only danger in maneuver is that you give yourself so many options that you yourself get confused. Keep it simple. Limit yourself to the options you can control. Here are further reflections on the ripening for the sickle strategy. By Byzantine Emperor Mauricius. Warfare is like hunting. Wild animals are taken by scouting, by nets, by lying in wait, by stalking, by circling around, and by other such stratagems rather than by sheer force. In waging war, we should proceed in the same way, whether the enemy be many or few. To try simply to overpower the enemy in the open, hand to hand and face to face, even though you might appear to win, is an enterprise which is very risky and can result in serious harm. Apart from extreme emergency, it is ridiculous to try to gain a victory which is so costly and brings only empty glory. From The Art of Maneuver by Robert R. Leonhard. Addicts of attrition, as Simkin calls them, generally cannot think beyond the battle, and they consider that the only way, or at least the preferred way, to defeat an enemy is to destroy the physical components of his army, especially the combat portions, armored fighting vehicles, troops, guns, etc. If the attrition addict appreciates war's intangibles at all, such as morale, initiative, and shock, he sees them only as combat multipliers with which to fight the attrition battle better. If the attrition warrior learns about maneuver, he sees it primarily as a way to get to the fight. In other words, he moves in order to fight. Maneuver theory, on the other hand, attempts to defeat the enemy through means other than simple destruction of his mass. Indeed, the highest and purest application of maneuver theory is to preempt the enemy, that is, to disarm or neutralize him before the fight. If such is not possible, the maneuver warrior seeks to dislocate the enemy forces, i.e., removing the enemy from the decisive point, or vice versa, thus rendering them useless and irrelevant to the fight. If the enemy cannot be preempted or dislocated, then the maneuver warfare practitioner will attempt to disrupt the enemy, i.e., destroy or neutralize his center of gravity, preferably by attacking with friendly strengths through enemy weaknesses. By Napoleon Bonaparte. Aptitude for maneuver is the supreme skill in a general. It is the most useful and rarest of gifts by which genius is estimated. From The Art of War by Sun Tzu. Now the army's disposition of force is like water. Water's configuration avoids heights and races downward. Water configures its flow in accord with the terrain. The army controls its victory in accord with the enemy. Thus, the army does not maintain any constant strategic configuration of power. Water has no constant shape. One who is able to change and transform in accord with the enemy and wrest victory is termed spiritual. From Aesop's Fables. The Reed and the Olive. The reed and the olive tree were arguing over their steadfastness, strength, and ease. The olive taunted the reed for its powerlessness and pliancy in the face of all the winds. The reed kept quiet and didn't say a word. Then, not long after this, the wind blew violently. The reed, shaken and bent, escaped easily from it, but the olive tree, resisting the wind, was snapped by its force. The story shows that people who yield to circumstances and to superior power have the advantage over their stronger rivals. The Campaigns of Napoleon by David G. Chandler. Of course, this beautiful simplicity of strategic movement, with its infinite flexibility, is extremely deceptive. The task of correlating and coordinating the daily movements of a dozen or more major formations, all moving along separate routes, of ensuring that every component is within 1 or at most 2 days' marching distance of its immediate neighbors, and yet at the same time preserving the appearance of an arbitrary and ill-coordinated scatter of large units in order to deceive the foe concerning the true gravity of his situation. This is the work of a mathematical mind of no common caliber. It is in fact the hallmark of genius, that infinite capacity for taking pains. The ultimate aim of all this carefully considered activity was to produce the greatest possible number of men on the battlefield, which on occasion had been chosen months in advance of the actual event. Bourrienne gives his celebrated eyewitness account of the first consul in the early days of the Italian campaign of 1800, lying full length on the floor, pushing colored pins into his maps and saying, "I shall fight him here, on the plain of the Scrivia," with that uncanny prescience which was in reality the product of mental calculations of computer-like complexity. After considering every possible course of action open to the Austrian melas, Bonaparte eliminated them one by one, made allowance for the effect of chance on events, and came up with the answer, subsequently borne out by the events of June 14th on the field of Marengo, which lies, surely enough, on the plain bounded by the rivers Bormida and Scrivia. From Characters by Jean de la Bruyère. The warrior and the statesman, like the skillful gambler, do not make their luck, but prepare for it, attract it, and seem almost to determine their luck. Not only are they, unlike the fool and the coward, adept at making use of opportunities when these occur, they know furthermore how to take advantage, by means of precautions and wise measures, of such and such an opportunity, or of several at once. If one thing happens, they win. If another, they are still the winners. The same circumstance often makes them win in a variety of ways. These prudent men may be praised for their good fortune as well as their good management, and rewarded for their luck as well as for their merits. From The Art of Maneuver by Robert R. Leonhard. Expanding on the issue of directive control, Lind introduces the reader to a decision-making model known as the Boyd cycle. Named for Colonel John Boyd, the term refers to the understanding that war consists of the repeated cycle of observation, orientation, decision, and action. Colonel Boyd constructed his model as a result of his observations of fighter combat in the Korean War. He had been investigating why American fighter pilots had been consistently able to best enemy pilots in dogfights. His analysis of opposing aircraft led to some startling discoveries. Enemy fighters typically outperformed their American counterparts in speed, climb, and turning ability, but the Americans had the advantage in two subtly critical aspects. First, the hydraulic controls allowed for faster transition from one maneuver to another. Second, the cockpit allowed for a wide field of view for the pilot. The result was that the American pilots could more rapidly observe and orient to the tactical situation moment by moment. Then, having decided what to do next, they could quickly change maneuvers. In battle, this ability to rapidly pass through the observation, orientation, decision, action loop, the Boyd cycle, gave the American pilots a slight time advantage. If one views a dogfight as a series of Boyd cycles, one sees that the Americans would repeatedly gain a time advantage each cycle, until the enemy's actions become totally inappropriate to the changing situations. Hence, the American pilots were able to out-Boyd cycle the enemy, thus outmaneuvering him and finally shooting him down. Colonel Boyd and others then began to question whether this pattern might be applicable to other forms of warfare as well. From The Art of Maneuver by Robert R. Leonhard. Mobility, defined as the ability to project power over distance, is another characteristic of good chess. It is the goal of a good chess player to ensure that each of his pieces can exert pressure upon a maximum number of squares, rather than being bottled up in a corner, surrounded by other pieces. Hence, the chess master looks forward to pawn exchanges, infantry battles, if you will, not because he is trying to wear down the enemy, but because he knows that he can project the power of his rooks, mechanized forces, down the resulting open files. In this manner, the chess master fights in order to move. This idea is central to maneuver warfare theory. And lastly, from Samurai Zen, The Warrior Koans, by Trevor Leggett. Number 71. The Victory in the Midst of 100 Enemies. To Priest Yozan, the 28th teacher at Enkakuji, came for an interview a samurai named Ryozan, who practiced Zen. The teacher said, "You are going into the bathtub stark naked without a stitch on. Now, 100 enemies in armor, with bows and swords, appear all around you. How will you meet them? Will you crawl before them and beg for mercy? Will you show your warrior birth by dying in combat against them? Or does a man of the way get some special holy grace?" Ryozan said, "Let me win without surrendering and without fighting." Test. Caught in the midst of the 100 enemies, how will you manage to win without surrendering and without fighting? Chapter 21. Negotiate while advancing. The Diplomatic War Strategy. People will always try to take from you in negotiation what they could not get from you in battle or direct confrontation. They will even use appeals to fairness and morality as a cover to advance their position. Do not be taken in. Negotiation is about maneuvering for power or placement, and you must always put yourself in the kind of strong position that makes it impossible for the other side to nibble away at you during your talks. Before and during negotiations, you must keep advancing, creating relentless pressure and compelling the other side to settle on your terms. The more you take, the more you can give back in meaningless concessions. Create a reputation for being tough and uncompromising, so that people are back on their heels before they even meet you. War by other means. After Athens was finally defeated by Sparta in the Peloponnesian War of 404 BC, the great city-state fell into steady decline. In the decades that followed, many citizens, including